Talk about the bureaucracy. And what in the world is the bureaucracy? Well, they're departments that help enforce the law. The president is the head of the executive branch, and he enforces laws, but he can't enforce every law every day all by himself, so he has groups of people who work underneath him to help him enforce individual types of laws. And of course, their leader, the president, lives here in the White House. So at the federal level of the bureaucracy, you have two different parts. The executive office of the president, who helps the president carry out day-to-day tasks, like making his schedule, making sure he gets from place to place on time, answering emails and phone calls, and making sure his meetings are set up properly with other people. And on the other side, you have the cabinet. They're a group of advisors for the president, and they help him make policy changes or help him enforce the law or just be a better leader about a certain type of law. They're the heads of all the departments of the bureaucracy together, and there's 15 total. They're appointed by the president and, of course, approved by the Senate because the Senate approves pretty much everything. So there's 15 departments total in the cabinet. Here's President Obama with the seals of all the departments over his head. Every department head is known as a secretary, except for the head of the Department of Justice. They are known as the Attorney General because they're not a Secretary of Justice. They're a qualified attorney, and they make sure that all attorneys are doing right because they are the head of, well, not the head of, but they are part of the judicial branch, and they help manage the judicial branch to make sure that they are interpreting the law at every level. So again, all the department heads are known as secretaries, like the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of Education, except for the one for the head of the Department of Justice, and they are the Attorney General. There are 5 major departments that you need to know. The first one is the Department of State, and they lead the creation and the action of foreign policy. Before Hillary Clinton was a presidential candidate, she was the Secretary of State and headed up all of our foreign operations in the world. She was appointed by President Obama. So the Department of State makes sure that our relations with other countries are set up correctly and enforced correctly, like our trade agreements, who can go in what water, who can go in what airspace. The Department of State makes sure that all of that is running smoothly. The Department of Defense, their goal is to ensure national security and to prevent war. So the Department of Defense makes sure that our military is running smoothly. They make sure that all 5 branches of the military are operating like they're supposed to be and making sure that they all follow federal and martial law. Martial law is for the military. Our next department is the Department of Justice, and they interpret the law and protect the rights of citizens. So again, the judicial branch interprets the law, and the Department of Justice is the agency that heads up the judicial branch and makes sure that everything is running smoothly there and that laws are being followed and enforced properly and interpreted. And again, the head of the Department of Justice is known as the Attorney General. The Department of the Treasury manages government revenue, how much money we bring in. The IRS, the people that will come and beat down your door if you don't pay your taxes, are part of the Department of the Treasury, and they manage the money that the government is bringing in, which is also your taxes. And again, the leader is known as the Secretary of the Treasury, just like Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of Homeland Security. And that's our next one, the Department of Homeland Security. They prevent and respond to foreign and domestic terrorism. So they make sure that everything is running smoothly around our borders. You'll see them in airports and in some major transportation places, like in Union Station or something like that, in a big city where a lot of different people can come in and out. The Department of Homeland Security makes sure that our borders are secure and makes sure that domestic terrorism is addressed and enforced properly. So those are our big 5. Our other 10 are the Department of Agriculture. They have to do with enforcing policy on farms and agriculture, food. Okay, the Department of Commerce makes sure that we trade well with other places, make sure that our trading routes, not really routes, but make sure that we trade well with each other, and make sure that each state is following the law. The Department of Education makes sure that everyone has equal access to an education. The Department of Energy, they keep our lights on, pretty much. The Department of Health and Human Services, they look out for public health, so they make sure that the general population is well cared for. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, is under the Department of Health and Human Services. So if ever you wanted to blame someone for having to get a flu shot every year or a bunch of vaccines when you're little, you can blame them. Our next one is the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They make sure that people have equal access to housing and that no one is denied the right to housing because of race, color, creed, or national origin, or religion, or anything else. The Department of the Interior makes sure that our land is cared for. So they head up conservation efforts like our natural resources. They are also in charge of managing the interests of the Native Americans and the Native Alaskans. So they make sure that those who live on a reservation still have to follow federal law, but they're not quite as strictly enforced. Our next one is the Department of Labor. They make sure we have a strong American workforce and that everybody who can and wants to is working. Our Department of Transportation makes sure that we have a safe and efficient transportation system so people can get around. Just like our highways. If you ever see an interstate highway that has a pothole in it or needs to be fixed, the DOT, Department of Transportation, will fix it and make sure that we can get from one place to another safely all across the country. Our last one is the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA. They administer benefits to veterans and their families. So like we talked about with the president, a former president gets to go, and their spouse and their children gets to go to a VA hospital at any point in time for medical expenses, and they'll be paid for by the VA. There's a lot of other agencies within these departments, because not all of these 15 departments can enforce the law by themselves either, so we have to delegate all the work out. We have the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. This is part of the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, excuse me. The FBI is also a part of the Department of Defense. They are the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They make sure that federal laws, if they're broken, they're investigated and enforced properly, and that should there be punishments for them, they're done right. My next one is the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. They're part of Homeland Security, and they make sure that any narcotics laws are followed properly. We have the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. And again, they're the people that worry about your vaccines every year and your flu shots. You have the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. They've got a lot going on. They're also a part of Homeland Security. They make sure that if any firearms laws are not being followed, if someone is hoarding firearms or explosives, that they are taken care of and addressed properly. The IRS, again, are the people that will beat down your door if you don't pay your taxes. They're part of the Department of the Treasury. Our next one is the Better Business Bureau. They're part of the Department of Commerce, and they make sure that customers are taken care of, so you can hold a business owner accountable if they're not following the law, or if they're using unfair business practices, like if they're discriminating against someone or a group of people. We have the CIS, the Citizenship and Immigration Services. They're part of the Department of Homeland Security, and they help you if you come back into the country, like with customs and things like that, if you're flying in from another country, or if you want to change your citizenship from one country to the United States, they'll help you with that. We have the National Guard, so if the governor declares a state of emergency in North Carolina, he can employ the National Guard, people on reserve in the Army, to come and help him. They're like the state version of the Army. They just kind of hang out in different states. And then we have FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration. Like when Hurricane Katrina hit in 2004, like 2004 maybe 06. Anyways, when that hit, FEMA set up temporary housing and a lot of help for other people. So these are the top 10 agencies, and of course have to have a picture of NCIS because they're a pretty great agency. It's a real thing, by the way. And at the state level, we have the governor and the lieutenant governor, Pat McCrory and Dan Forrest. We have the Council of State. They act like the cabinet at the state level. They head up all the departments in the state. And then we have agencies like the SBI, the State Bureau of Investigation. So again, the national level of bureaucracy is the president, the cabinet, and the 15 departments and other agencies. And at the state level, we have the governor and lieutenant governor, the council of state, and agencies. This has been the bureaucracy.